Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to theAnalysis.news podcast. Don't forget, there's a donate button at the top of the webpage. This is part 3 of my discussion with Richard Kozul-Wright, who's the director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies at UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He's the author of the 2020 report of UNCTAD, Transforming Economies, Making Industrial Policy Work for Growth, Jobs, and Development. And you really should listen to part 1 and part 2, because it will make a whole lot more sense if you do, but it will still make sense, I think, even if you don't. So before I really introduce and say hi to Richard, I'm going to read a quote from the report. So this is in a chapter, Almost Everyone Left Behind. In a textbook world, income distribution is a well-rehearsed fiction. Wages are negotiated in markets where everyone has equal bargaining power, and the outcome is a wage reflecting each worker's productivity. Only in this narrow sense is income distribution fair. In the real hyper-globalized world of austerity and depressed employment, corporations wield unique power in wage negotiations, and the textbook foundations of fairness and distribution melt away. Even so, any rise in inequality from more liberalizations is justified, assuming that the gains from improved allocation of resources, empowered middle-class consumers, and improved government revenues would be more than enough to compensate those at the bottom. That conclusion requires dubious assumptions like full employment everywhere and at all times. It also misses the point. Power and policies, not fair competition, determine how adjustment processes play out. So, thanks for joining us, Richard.
Nice to be back, Paul.
So break that down. When you call this fair negotiations, and they keep talking about a fair wage, and it's almost like fair taxes, that it's a well-rehearsed fiction. Why do you call it so?
It's one of the great weaknesses of conventional economics, its inability really to deal with the distribution question in any serious way, and to offer what is ultimately just a justification for the status quo. I mean, that's a long-standing, debate and critique of most heterodox economists, I think.
What is that?
Anyone who is outside of the kind of mainstream neoclassical tradition, based on these ideas that economic activity is simply a set of transactions between individuals who are fully rational and fully endowed with all the necessary information to make optimal decisions, and that as long as markets are left alone and not interfered with by governments, then prices will allocate resources in the most efficient way, and everyone will be happy. Anyone who kind of recognizes that as a kind of mythical view of capitalist economies, I think, is in one way or another heterodox, and it's a broad group. It encompasses everybody from post-Keynesians through Austrians and Marxists, to be quite honest. But it's a rejection of that very stylized view of optimal market behavior.
Okay, well, keep breaking down then. So explain why that's a fiction, and how does it affect people?
For the reasons we said, in terms of the fact that, power. If you take power out of the transactional relationship between buyers and consumers and producers, between creditors and debtors, and of course between labor and capital, you're going to take out one of the most important elements of those relationships. In our world, I think what we want to try. Everyone recognizes that inequality has increased massively over the last 3 decades or 4 decades everywhere. It's not, no one disputes that. I think there are different attempts to understand why that's taken place. Amongst many economists, it's a debate about whether trade or technological change has been the source of these growing inequalities. And behind that is this idea that I mean, trade and technology are good, but somehow certain groups of people have been forgotten about or left behind is the kind of phrase that reverberates around our world to kind of explain the growing disparities within and across countries, and this idea that somehow we forgot about people, and all we need to do is just kind of give them a bit more education or train them a bit better, and everything will be all right. That we want to critique in the analysis that we've been doing now for some years, and to remind people really that inequality is hardwired into the rules of this hyper-globalized world of very footloose capital and increasingly flexible and precarious labor market conditions and policies that are oriented towards maintaining the place of those at the top of the pile. So, it's not a kind of accident that we've seen these growing inequalities. It's how the system works. It's how the system is intended to work. In the rents that there's these very increasingly large semi-monopolistic or monopolistic corporations with a huge amount of economic political power in a position to generate rents for themselves. So rents rise to the top, wages are kept down as labor market institutions and regulations are eviscerated. So wages stagnate, and kind of desperation. The one thing that trickles down in that world is desperation, essentially. And so that kind of recognition that it's the rules of the game and not kind of accident or forgetfulness that has created the kinds of inequalities that we've seen, I think is kind of central to the work that we're doing.
And desperation is very profitable. I know when I lived in Baltimore, I keep citing this example, but I think it's a good one. It's kind of typical of what was going on there. There's such high unemployment in Baltimore that people were desperate for jobs. And so we talked to a guy at Johns Hopkins Hospital who had 14 years seniority, cleaned surgical rooms after, had to clean up the blood and guts, risking infection, had to take special drugs to try to avoid getting infected. And at the time we talked to the guy, was maybe 2-3 years ago, he was making $13 an hour. And it's only possible to get such cheap labor if people are so desperate. And you can look at that on a global scale. And then you talk about footloose capital, the fact that big corporations can go where the labor is cheapest, play countries off against each other to some extent. To some extent, they need a China that has a disciplined work and trained workforce. But even there, the Chinese government for a long time was helping keep wages low, maybe a little less so now, but for a long time they were. And you have a situation where in your report, you talk about how the share of income that goes to profits has been going to up and up in relationship to wages. But I think you make a very important point about the moment we're in, which is all of this existed pre-pandemic. But you write, if these pre-COVID-19 forces of wage repression remain in place, the labor share will likely continue its decline in many economies in the next years, exacerbating inequalities. In the United States, after a 50-year descent, the labor share is now back to its 1950s level. If current trends continue, in 10 years' time, it will be back to the brink of the abyss level of 1930. And one should add to that, with this massive unemployment, there's no way wages are going up. The only way they're going is down.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there's even more to that story, particularly at the top. I think there's a tendency to, particularly in our circles, to ignore the nature of economic power at the top of the tree, and a lot of those a lot of that increased profit share goes to very large international corporations. I mean, you have a layer of much smaller and more precarious businesses that do not benefit in the same way. But and you watch how these large firms operate. Not only are they in a position to generate very large rents through intellectual property and control over brands and monopsony power and other mechanisms, but of course they're in a position hide those profits from governments. So effective tax rates are extremely low as a consequence, and that forces governments into borrowing and problems that emerge in the balance sheets of governments. And so, not only do they hide the profits in, tax havens, most of which, of course, despite the fact that people have this image of tax havens as somehow being kind of Caribbean islands with, fancy guys in Panama shirts parading on beaches. But I mean, most of the big tax havens in this world are in the advanced economies. But these companies are able to shift profits around these tax havens to hide their profits. And what do they do with their liquid resources? They don't invest in productive activities and investment and skills. They buy back their own shares, which has been taking place on a phenomenal scale since the end of the global financial crisis. The figure I saw that was, I think the S&P 500 companies have channeled $1 trillion a year into share buybacks as part of their financing them themselves.
And interesting enough, accumulating almost the exact same amount of corporate debt, about $1 trillion.
Yeah, because it's more profitable to borrow and invest in financial assets than there is in your own kind of productive activities. Because who are you going to sell this stuff to as wages are repressed, demand is kept low, and the returns on investment in those activities become minimal. And the best way to make money is to engage in short-term financial transactions of one kind or another. And these big corporations are sitting on piles of liquid asset that they use for those purposes.
You write, a sustainable recovery requires faster wage growth for low-wage jobs too, in order to revive productivity and employment growth. Wage repression and ever weaker labor market rules are only going to make the world economy's pre-existing conditions worse. And it's interesting when they had this CARE legislation, which gave some money to people during the pandemic, which is far from over. And they're as we talk, they supposedly are going to start negotiating again a package in the Congress, although it looks like it's not really going to happen. But the Republicans, one of the things they're most concerned about is that some people were getting more subsidy than they were getting wages when they were working, and how horrible that was, that people might get used to that kind of money and demand higher wages. Well, actually, that's precisely what is needed. But everything they do is in the other direction. They see such a direct connection that their profit, pay higher wages, your profits are not as high. And same thing globally. And how they think a world, much of which is going to be devastated by the pandemic, is going to somehow also be a market for goods, unless the Americans just don't care about any market outside the United States. The bottom line is that it's simply not rational.
This is where we try and link in the notion. I mean, everyone's now talking about recovering better, right? Or building back better is that Biden slogan? Yeah,
something like that. Yeah,
building back better. But yeah, I mean, obviously, our solution to that is partly a kind of an expansionary macroeconomic agenda focused on full employment with an appropriate mix of expansionary monetary policy, but very importantly, fiscal policy and public investment. But that's not the end of the story, right? I mean, clearly you need if you're going to recover better, if we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the post-2009 financial crisis, we need this kind of New Deal agenda. And at least our reading of the old New Deal was that it was a combination of first of all relief, then recovery, and then redistribution and regulation, particularly regulation of finance. And the redistribution was all about strengthening organized labor in one way or another, and building a middle class on the basis of this. I listened to Biden and in the debate, and his inability to defend the idea of a Green New Deal is quite shocking, because it was the old New Deal that precisely made the middle class great in America the first time around, and the inability to kind of make that connection with the kinds of policies that are needed, post COVID-19 was pretty sad, really. I thought, but those are the kinds of, that kind of combination of recovery and redistribution and re-regulation is the heart of the alternative that we want to say is not only relevant in the United States or Western Europe, but also in many developing countries too.
The reluctance of Biden to talk about a New Deal in that way, people try to say is because he doesn't want to alienate centrist voters and Republicans who might come over to the Democrats. And maybe there's a minor factor in that. But I think it's far more, he doesn't want to alienate the financial sector, because right now I think a good part of the financial sector, maybe even the majority, are okay with Biden being president. I think they would like to see a Republican Senate so they can control anything that actually gets done. But I think they realize Trump is enough of a madman that they'd rather have a more reliable neoliberal politician running the state. But that puts a lot of pressure on Biden not to talk about something that sounds too much like a New Deal. I once asked Tom Ferguson, who's a political economist, he knows a lot of the people in the finance sector, what he thought, how they would react to a Bernie Sanders or Warren versus fascism, if that was their choice, like Trumpian real authoritarianism, or a Warren or a Sanders. He said that they would choose authoritarianism if a wealth tax was on the table. That to them is simply unacceptable, and that's part of an outlook and pressure that's on Biden for staying within the realm of what the financial sector will accept, which I guess is also a reflection that sort of a people's movement pushing from the other direction isn't strong enough right now.
Yeah, I guess, and that's probably true. That's not exclusively a United States problem, I guess. But I think, and that rejection of the New Deal is obviously, that this begins with Clinton, if not before. But the sad thing, the point that we want to try and make is that, those kinds of measures were the basis in which you got an expanding middle class. And true of Western Europe, although we didn't call it a New Deal, but similar types of policies that focused on full employment, in which wages were in some way connected to productivity improvements because of the strength of organized labor. Because of that, firms were forced to kind of innovate and invest rather than channel their profits into financial activities of one kind. You get this kind of virtuous circle in the 1950s, without wanting to idealize it, but you get this kind of virtuous circle in the 1950s and 60s across advanced capitalist economies, which was the basis of a growing middle class, and that's, given the way in which we've seen the wage share decline consistently over 40 or 50 years, that underneath that politically, sociologically, is this evisceration of the vanishing middle class, I think was the title of a book by Peter Temin, and that's what you've seen, and you would have thought progressive politicians would want to hold that up as an alternative to, that kind of what we've seen over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, and the kind of anxieties and frustrations that has bred.
Well, you in your report say if they don't take the kind of approach you're suggesting, you call it a doomsday scenario. So in the next segment of our interview, we'll talk about your recommendations for what you think should be done. And also, I'm going to raise the question, shouldn't more public ownership be part of those recommendations? But we'll do that in part 4 of our conversation. So thanks very much for joining us, Richard.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the invitation.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast.